broader views, so you make connections if you believe in architecture in context to community as opposed to an autonomous event. You want to talk about how much it's about itself and how much it's about the other? Probably both have things to say about
it. The one that Michael said, I'll give you the hard one. It's a complicated issue. I mean, there's also the issue of autonomy in the sense of, sort of philosophical sense of Kant that says we have an obligation to do good, that there's a kind of moral code in what we do. And that's certainly something that's been part of the profession, where we say, it's like in doctors, you shall do no harm. So that's part of autonomy, that as individuals we have the responsibility, or as faculty members we have the responsibility to teach students or to inculcate in students the desire to do good with their designs and to not harm the world. So that's one view, right, of autonomy. That's sort of the way that Schumacher, even though he's talking about parametricism, he's really referring to the fact that architecture has a larger responsibility, or architects have a larger responsibility to society than just form making. So even though he's on this is probably getting too specific, but even though he's on the form making side, he's actually counter to what somebody like Peter Eisenman would say in terms of architecture being only about itself. I tend to, in this, we probably are on opposite sides here. I tend to disagree that architecture can really do social good and that it's architects' responsibility to do that, with the caveat that, of course, there's issues like responsibility in terms of, not being wasteful, or to have a kind of sense of using resources effectively, and to, making architecture that is useful. I think that is important. But in terms of predetermining a kind of social good, or sort of saying that through architecture we can change behavior, or that we can somehow, make people behave in a different way, I think that's beyond the purview of what we're doing, what we can do, the capacity of what we can do. That in the way that it is architecture is still a material profession.
Scott, I would say that if one of our architecture majors came up to me and said, I want to be the next Scott Johnson, I wouldn't try to dissuade him or her from thinking of a profession in the form of one person. But maybe it's, I don't know if it's because of my training as an urban planner or what it is, but I also think that architecture does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a social and community context. And while I would agree with Sarah that architecture and design cannot change the world by itself, it can have a powerful influence. Leaving physical determinism aside, just the idea that the way that buildings are designed and built may not change a whole society, but I think they do have some influence on the way people think about the city they're in and what they do during the day, and that therefore the work of architects ought to be evaluated on some kind of social or community basis, not just as freestanding works of art that don't exist in a context.
I mean, sorry, just to clarify, I agree with what you're saying. It's just, the problem I have is when architects believe that they can determine causality. It's not that, yes, buildings obviously affect society, and certainly buildings, a good building will transform it, but as an architect, having the knowledge that you can control that, the kind of end result, I find questionable, and I think it often leads to, and we make, as architects, so many easy, instead of saying, okay, there's corollaries in these particular functions, right? We have, we know that there is some association between having a building that's 200 feet tall and having, lack of sunlight at the street. There certainly are things that we can determine, but more often we train students, or we convince students that if they can have a very good argument, that somehow that they're able to control the outcome. And I think that that's problematic, a kind of larger outcome than the kind of material, a material one.
I think my last question for you both is one about sort of globalism. Many practices now that wouldn't have imagined it just a few years ago are doing work abroad that raises all kinds of questions as to international protocols in architecture versus regional protocols. And sometimes one gets hired to do something you do here because they want it there. It's kind of a consumerist thing. And sometimes you can actually go there and do something that's legitimate with respect to the local place. But in any event, architects are traveling the world to do work. Do you see that as important in the student experience? What kind of relationship do you have between your students and your curriculum, and a prospect that probably many of them, if not all of them, will work in various locations?
Well, let me start with an answer to this, and then I'll let Sarah follow up. Our graduates, like graduates of other architecture programs, many of them have gone into jobs working on projects in other countries. And if it had not been for the opportunity to work in China or Dubai or other places, they probably wouldn't have been able to work as architects. So the globalization of architecture definitely has created opportunities. So our program definitely has a responsibility to prepare students to be able to step into those kinds of roles. As Sarah mentioned, we have a program that sends students to China every summer. Some of our students go to the California State University program in Florence. And I should add one thing which we haven't really covered during this discussion today, which is the unique social mission of Cal Poly Pomona and how it affects our architecture program and our other environmental design programs. Because we are part of the state university, in other words, we're part of the system of public higher education, and because of our location in Southern California, we have an unusually high percentage of students who are the first in their family to go to college. Many of them are the children of immigrants. Many of them have never been, not only outside the United States, but many of them have never been outside California. And so that means that for our architecture department and for our other programs, because we want these to be global citizens and global architects, we have to do as much as we can to give our students a chance to get the skills, the experience of living or working in another country before they leave, hopefully to equip them well to compete for jobs in that global marketplace after they graduate.
Certainly, while most of the students come from Southern California, in terms of where they've lived most recently, they're actually a reflection of the demographics of Southern California as well. They're first generation, second generation Americans coming from China, coming from Taiwan. There's a lot of Koreans, obviously a very large Latino population. So the kind of world view is very close too, because they're all, they come, or at least have families all over the world. In terms of practice too, or in terms of the design work, the reality is that we're all building or designing to a kind of global marketplace, and whether there really isn't any kind of regionalism in architecture anymore, at least that I've seen.
Well, that's a big subject, and we'll have that for the next conversation. Is there anything that I have not asked either of you that you'd like to say or we've omitted?
Years ago, our faculty and staff were on furlough one day a month, and but the good news is I think we're on the rebound. We're rebuilding. Even when our budgets were really tight, the university was allocating money to hire new faculty because of the assumption that we couldn't just sit still, even with short-term financial problems. We had to keep replenishing our faculty with bright young faculty to replace those who were retiring. The architecture department is about to hire someone for a new structures and building technology position, someone who we hope will combine both experience in private practice, but also a comfort with being in academia. So my main point is, even though the State University has gone through some tough times in recent years, we're rebuilding. And I think that a college which has developed a reputation over decades of doing very good things will continue to do good things, thanks not only to support from the taxpayers and voters of the state, but also because our faculty and our students are really dedicated to what we do.
Great. Well, maybe on that happy note, I thank you, Michael. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks very much.